Hey folks, this week's review is definitely a doozy, given that I received a press copy of Fallen Flag Studios' Eldest Souls, an indie title that is unrepentantly inspired by Dark Souls. That's right, I dove deep into this brutal boss battler, but did I walk away from this feeling satisfied at the slaughter, or was it ultimately a soulless experience? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Once, there was a time when humans and gods lived in harmony. Siblings spat forth from the moon onto the world. Yet that fraternal peace was fragile, shattered by the dark god Exile, whose machinations saw humanity subjugated. Yet once his mischief was wrought, and he'd finished basking in their misery, he vanished. Just as a suspiciously cloaked stranger led humanity to rise up and overtake the gods. In a great and violent crusade, the entire pantheon was vanquished and imprisoned, while humanity began to recover, for all of a hot minute. Exil returned with a vengeance, making use of his trapped siblings to unleash such devastation as to nearly extinguish humankind, until you arrive. The moon's final child dropped onto the world in order to right the calamity that's overtaken it. Anyways, none of this is spoilers, since the game hashes out all of this within a minute of you booting up the game in a narrated cutscene. I mean, they don't quite go cloaked figure is sus, but the lines are there to be read between. That said, the intro is the most story-dense element of the experience. Once you've seen it, you'll be primarily fed story tidbits through NPC dialogue, item descriptions, and a few interactable objects in the environment. It's sparse, to be sure, yet given the overall scale of the game, it works well enough, and they do certainly serve a purpose, providing more context about the world at large, as well as about the bosses you encounter. There's also a number of different endings to pursue, mostly tied to whether you engage in making divine pacts, but these wound up feeling rather similar, though I still support my decision to side with my precious crow boys. That said, it wasn't the story that drew me to Eldest Souls. I mean, I was interested, sure, but at the end of the day, I'd been enticed by the words Souls-like and challenging boss battles. But well, here's the thing. While Eldest Souls certainly does provide a hard-as-nails boss-focused title, call it a Souls-like might be disingenuous. It's definitely inspired. It happily wears those influences on its sleeve, but it may be best to leave it at that. For one thing, the idea of a Souls-like brings to mind the idea of exploring a world, and yet Elder Souls feels lacking in this department. That's not to say there isn't a world to explore, but it's a much smaller, focused title. There are no enemies to challenge your march forward, there's only ruins and desolation. That, and the occasional environmental hazard, which one involves an annoying platforming maze riddled with bullets and a lot of instant death. Woo. Still, I did enjoy picking over the husk of Eldest Souls world, finding bits of lore and the items needed to engage with NPC subquests for boosts or paving the way towards an ending. That was pleasant, but it didn't feel central. By the end of it, exploring around was just a small bit of busy work. Fast traveling around the map to snag an item only to go somewhere else and turn it in. And it doesn't simply end there. Death, for instance, is far cheaper than its peers. See, while Eldest Souls does allow players to rapidly respawn upon death, it doesn't carry the same weight as its supposed peers. There's no penalty, no resources to be lost or handicap to be accrued or navigated. No, Eldest Souls' focus is on its combat and in a very specific circumstance, as it wants players to face off against the 8 ball-bustingly badass bosses it has to offer, and die miserably until they learn how to overcome them. And look, I know there's 9 bosses, but that first one doesn't count at first. I mean, they don't even show up in the game's arena mode, so they don't count. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is this title is more akin to Darkstar Sinner. It's an arena-based boss battler as well, and honestly, it doesn't disappoint. Each of the bosses do have their own distinct identities, providing players with unique mechanics to learn and overcome that differentiate them from their peers. And all of these bosses have multiple phases that once you've gotten comfortable enough to whittle down their sizable health bars, you'll have modified or even brand new abilities to contend with. It's fucking harrowing, but it's also excellent. And I'm not kidding about those, by the way. These guys have enough beef on them that you could mistake them for a cargo train full of Slim Jims. They will soak hits. But here's the thing. Since you don't have generic enemies to grind off and only a few optional upgrades from the game's side quests, it's not really possible for you to become vastly more powerful than the game can account for. So these fights will always be a challenge. Hell, even when the game starts to offer you options between bosses, you still won't find yourself with an easy path to victories. You simply can't ramp up to a point where you'd invalidate that challenge. But it's fine. Like, this is fine. Because we've got some pretty meaty combat to go into. Like I said earlier, death is cheap, and that means the game will happily dole it out. To that end, you do have a few tools to help you out. One is your dash, which is less of a stamina meter and more of a bar that can store up to 3 charges. It's a bit more forgiving than it sounds though, since if you dodge through an attack, it replenishes extremely quickly. That said, you also have more to your survival options than that, but it's not an Estus flask or some proxy. Instead, it comes down to your attack options. See, while you normally have a basic combo, you can hold down the attack button to do a heavy charge. Not only does this help close the distance and do decent damage, it fills up a blood bar that allows you to regenerate health on hit. And if you keep holding, you'll continue into a pretty solid hard-hitting combo that also provides you healing as long as your blood bar is over half full. And you gain access to a blood burst, which is an especially heavy attack that drains out the blood bar, but it hits like a train. Honestly, it's fairly straightforward, especially once you start using it, but honestly, mastering how to slip between a boss's sweeping attacks to siphon much needed health, to make use of those openings while avoiding the temptation of greed, is a difficult balance to maintain, and their capacity to kill you in as little as 2 to 3 shots with their heaviest attacks keeps the pressure on at all times. And that's not even getting started on if you decide to be entirely extra and chase after the 0 damage boss achievements. I got one of those. Singular. And that was it. Also, while your arsenal starts out simple, it doesn't stay that way. Once you've felled the first boss, you're introduced to skill points. They're 1 per boss, but they provide some very powerful options as they enable you to spec into one of Elder Souls' 3 talent trees. There's the aggressive Berserk tree, which provides players a lot of options for stacking absurd damage multipliers, the mobile Wind Slash tree, which grants a very strong dash slide, and homing leaves to help you keep up the pressure, and, well, the counter tree, which I wound up using a lot because parrying bosses just really jived with me. Now, while you can only invest in one of these trees, they're all fairly flexible as they have a pair of branches that you can travel down, which are in turn composed of a number of mutually exclusive skills, so you get to custom tailor how you are going to make your character. With all of this said, you're then able to freely rearrange your skills in these trees, or even just swap over to an entirely new tree, since you're able to refund points whenever you're not in combat, which is amazing if you're finding one isn't really jiving with how a boss attacks, or you're just not really having a good time with one of the trees. And this isn't the only bit of character customization you can do either. See, once you smite your first actual god, read the second boss / the not tutorial boss, you acquire a shard, something that every deity but the last will give. These essentially provide you 2 options, as you can either passively imbue them into abilities to grant them special perks and change how they function, and this includes all of the abilities associated with your skill trees, or you can equip one of them as an active ability. And they're honestly pretty awesome. So many of them have distinct functions that can really help just flesh out a cohesive build. For instance, I really like the Glacial Bloodburst variant, since it would cause a damaging ice shard to spawn in its wake, which would then recharge the blood burst and let me do it again, which was devastating to immobile targets and let me essentially infinitely chain blood bursts. Another skill let me sacrifice my health to be able to counter again after a successful counter, letting me chain perfect parries consecutively and earn back health provided I could slip in a charge attack or, oh, I don't know, see my blood burst bar charged up again because of the... Yeah, no, it's fucking amazing. Just genuinely good stuff. Some of them were more finicky for me, Light for instance, or the mirror ability, but there's something for everyone there, especially if you intend on tackling New Game Plus. I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard there was a New Game Plus, I knew it was gonna be a step up. What I was not expecting was the sheer sadistic escalation in the boss's endurance, their damage, or the fact they were granted new attack patterns, which are absolutely hellish compared to their vanilla variants. Like, the base game is already quite challenging, but New Game Plus makes a number of these segments feel absolutely nightmarish, and it took fine-tuning everything to be able to eke out 3 wins. 3. And that was after a phenomenal amount of deaths. It's just brutal. Though if you feel the compulsive need to max out your skill trees, it's also the only way, since the cost of skills begins to scale up after your 8th spent point, and bosses are still only giving you 1 per. On the bright side, your shards also level up to try and stay competitive. Given they don't scale at the same ratio as the boss's stats though. But hey, if you enjoyed the game but don't want to progress to the hell that's New Game Plus, well, there's the arena mode I mentioned, which also unlocks after you beat the game. This honestly is pretty rad since it lets you fight the bosses, practice against them for achievements, and just overall try your hand at both the New Game Plus bosses as well as their base difficulty variants. It's also how I got around to getting that perfect boss achievement though. No such luck for that tutorial boss, he's just not there. I know I said that, but it still hurts me. Anyways, there is more things I have to give Eldest Souls some credit for though. For one thing, while it might be beating you into a complete pulp, the game looks good while doing it. There is a scenic quality to the ruined environments you traverse, though as good as they look, they pale in comparison to the bosses and their animations. Those guys look great, and I can't count the number of times I found myself genuinely impressed at a phase transition or how an attack sequence looked. Really, in the latter cases, it was also solid appreciation of just how well things were telegraphed. And as for the sound design, while it might not have been the lengthiest journey, the game does have a distinct soundtrack for each encounter, which is just really nice. Moreover, I was fairly fond of the voice work during the game's intro. It's just genuinely good narration that helps to provide some gravitas to the scenes playing out when the game boots up. And with that said, we come to the conclusion, and frankly, while I may have had my ass royally served to me by Eldest Souls, I had an overall good time the whole while. Combat is tense and pulse-pounding in a way I haven't encountered in a long while, and I thoroughly enjoyed exploring the gamut of offensive options I was building up as I progressed the game. Also, while the game does recommend using controllers, I played the crux of this on keyboard, and your controls are customizable, which is another plus. Still, while there were heaps to devote myself to insofar as combat went, I did find myself wishing that there was more to the world exploration itself. At the end of the day, if you're not chasing perfect boss encounters, New Game Plus, or want to see a very slightly different ending, this may wind up feeling a bit short. Ultimately though, I would be remiss to deny the craft that went into making Eldest Souls. It's an extremely competent and clever boss battler, just one geared towards individuals who are willing and able to devote themselves to the gamut of challenges it has to provide, with the full knowledge of it never relenting insofar as difficulty goes. Which is to say, for those folks craving something to kick their teeth in, this is definitely going to be a solid hit. Personally, I enjoyed it a great deal, even though it had me gritting my teeth in frustration. And yet I also recognize that there's going to be members of the audience who are less keen on this sort of thing, especially since it doesn't offer much in the way of handicaps or even a pause button. Yes, my cats murdered me multiple times during my playthrough. What I'm basically trying to say though is, to those folks less apt for this sort of experience, well, I certainly wouldn't blame you for passing this one over. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, you can check the video description to find a link to my community, the Critic Cauldron, and a Patreon link if you enjoy what me and my editors do. Lastly, if you want to see me get absolutely destroyed in indie games, check out twitch.tv/Arlyeon. With all that said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.